The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, today joining you from New York City, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, today we're going to step back into the Middle East and we're going to look back at Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas's 4-day visit to China last week to get perspectives from both the Israeli and the Palestinian side. The Palestinian leader was welcomed with full military honors last week at the Great Hall of the People. He also met with Chinese President Xi Jinping, and he was the first Arab leader this year to go to China, so there was a lot of symbolism on it. They announced a number of initiatives, from BRI initiatives, development initiatives, as well as an upgrade of their diplomatic ties to a strategic partnership. The Chinese also appointed a new special envoy to meet with both Israeli and Palestinian officials. This, of course, is part of China's ambition to become a mediator in this conflict and more broadly throughout the Middle East. At the end of the meeting, they issued a joint statement. Let me just read you through a few of the key points in the joint statement. Nothing really that new, but a reestablishment and a restatement of a number of different long-standing priorities. So there were gifts given to both sides. So the Chinese gave gifts to the Palestinians in the form of reaffirming the call for an independent Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital. The joint statement also called for Palestine's full membership in the UN and the resumption of peace talks under the Land for Peace premise. So those, again, are long-standing Palestinian demands, nothing too radically new. At the same time, the Palestinians gave a few gifts to the Chinese, namely the unequivocal backing of China's policy towards Muslims in Xinjiang, which the joint statement said, quote, "This has nothing to do with human rights, and it's aimed at excising extremism and opposing terrorism and separatism." The joint statement went on to say, Palestine resolutely opposes using the Xinjiang problem as a way of interfering in China's internal affairs. Again, those are also long-standing Chinese talking points on Xinjiang, so nothing really new. Cobus, this visit caps what's been a very busy past 6 months for the Chinese in their Mideast diplomacy. After all, it started last December when President Xi traveled to Saudi Arabia. Then Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi, he came to Beijing in February. And then in March, there was the revelation that China had brokered the Iran-Saudi Arabia deal to reestablish diplomatic ties between the two countries. So a lot of discussion in the media during this time is that China is moving to displace the U.S. as the mediator of choice in the region. What do you think of all this? What's your take on it?
I think in a lot of ways, this kind of victory that China had in bringing together Iran and Saudi Arabia has been overstated, I think. And of course we'll delve into that more. But what I think has been understated, I think, in a lot of these discussions is the very rapid growth of commercial and other ties between China and Saudi Arabia. So, on the back of all of this diplomacy that's happened, and a lot of this diplomacy is just optics, I think, there's very real kind of commercial connections, including the fact that in 2022 alone, 1.5 million passengers traveled between Saudi Arabia and China alone. So keep in mind that was during China's COVID shutdown. So that's very interesting. And on the back of that, we also saw a dense number of cooperation agreements, including a lot of cooperation agreements on renewable energy between Saudi Arabia and China, and also between China and the UAE, China and other powers in the Middle East. So we're seeing a lot of expansion of RMB usage, RMB trade agreements, a lot of renewable energy agreements, all of this kind of engagement happening under the surface of the diplomacy. So I think even as everyone is, I think to a certain extent, overstating the diplomacy, I think they're understating what's happening on the commercial level.
And let's not forget that the United States is still an active player in Mideast diplomacy. So while President Abbas was in Beijing, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken flew to Riyadh to meet with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. At the same time, the Americans have been in active discussions with the Israelis to try and broker what they are hoping, but again, it seems like a long shot right now, some kind of détente between Saudi Arabia and Israel as well. So the U.S. remains an active player as much as, again, we've been hearing about the narratives that the Chinese are displacing the United States. So let's get two perspectives on this, one from the Arab side, another from the Israeli side. And we are thrilled to have back on the show again our old friend Tuvia Gering, who's a researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies in Jerusalem. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and the author of the indispensable Discourse Power newsletter that provides fascinating insights into what Chinese scholars are publishing and saying. That is a free newsletter. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. And again, it's absolutely invaluable. Tuvia, good afternoon. Great to have you back on the show again.
It's great to be back. Thank you.
And for the first time, we're thrilled to have CGSP's new Arabic editor, Jony Essa, to join us as well. Jony oversees our Arabic language service, which you can find a link to also in the show notes. Jony, a very good afternoon.
Thank you for hosting me.
So, Jony, let's start with you. It's been a few days since President Abbas has returned from China. What are people saying about the trip?
So people are calling the trip a success, and they're emphasizing the trip as the visit of friendship, partnership, and peace, and basically emphasizing it as taking and putting the Palestinian-Israeli conflict back into the spotlight. So they see this as being anniversary of the 35-year partnership between the Chinese and the Palestinians. And they see the trip as a major success, with it being done in this time, specifically at this time, with talks also being emphasized about normalization between Israel and other Arab powers. In addition to normalization, you can't forget Palestinian peace process. So they're seeing this in this perspective.
And Jony, just to follow up on that, I saw very high levels of approval for China's role among Palestinians. So, in that discussion, what are some of the themes in the Palestinian response to why China specifically is a good partner for the Palestinians in this peace process?
So they see Chinese as an alternative partner that can focus more on development than the United States, who is seen as more biased to the Israeli side. China basically can offer the Palestinians plans and projects that the Americans cannot when it comes to development. So one of the major things that we saw was building on the BRI agreement and trying to sign maybe between 10 to 14 agreements that vary a spectrum of fields. So the Palestinian youth and the Palestinian public see the Chinese as more of a power that's based on development, less than a power that's considering only geostrategic analysis or considerations.
So, Tuvia, over in your neighborhood in Jerusalem, I think the visit was viewed in very different terms. Let me just read for you from the Ynet News, a column that was written in response. It said, "There's no escaping it, and it must be said out loud. Israel-China relations are on the decline from a political diplomatic perspective." Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was pretty clear in his response to the Abbas visit and saying that there really doesn't seem to be a need for an alternative to the United States right now. So it didn't seem like he was embracing China becoming a mediator in the process. And generally, it seemed to me as if the visit was received with a much chillier reception than what Jony's talking about in the Palestinian side.
Yeah, so the column was written by my colleague at the INSS, Galia Lavi. I don't know if I completely subscribe to the full decline of relationship between Israel and China. But a couple of things to note is, first, it's overstating that there was an Israeli reaction because there was none. The trip was not covered in Hebrew media. There's absolutely zero attention to it, except for Galia's column, because that's our job, of course. But there is no bandwidth to deal with anything other than the judicial reform that is internally going in Israeli politics and the Iranian file. Other than that, Abbas visited China. They both support each other on their core interests. It's a political show. China had been biased before the visit. It will be biased against Israel after the visit. And it always votes against us. It doesn't take our security considerations seriously. And of course, all of this is contrary to what it would like to portray itself. So that's why there's paying very little attention to it. There's also still a belief that China is not a serious mediator. It is not willing to put its money where its mouth is and actually engage in things that would make us succumb losses or have to invest any political or economic capital. So it's just a political show. And as some political shows, you can pay them attention or just take them at what it is, what they are.
And Tuvia, following up on that, what was the reaction in Israel to the earlier Iran-Saudi detente and then particularly China's narrative about it brokering that detente?
Yeah, so here we had something that Israelis paid more attention, and I think we talked about it in our last episode where I participated. And Israel, of course, is concerned about any developments that will legitimize Iran and give it more access to funds, which enable it to continue its terrorism and other activities in the region. And that China took a part in it, it was important perhaps on a symbolic level. But as you mentioned before, we all know that China just prodded them to cross the finishing line and took the photo finish. But there had been a much longer process brokered through Iraq, Oman, and even the Americans between two sides that already wanted, for their own internal reasons and external too, to reach a detente. But that's beside the points, I think, China. That's just a good reminder for Israel that China is an involved player in the region. So I think that was a big take here, and that it might play a bigger role in the future, but still everything is very tentative.
So, Jony, when you hear what Tuvia is saying, that the visit didn't get any response in Israel, that the Israelis don't seem to be taking the Chinese seriously, then I guess it begs the question of what was the point of this whole endeavor? I mean, maybe it was just for the optics that Abbas, he feels stuck. He wants to get the peace process that's been stalled since 2014 started again. He sees the Chinese as a way to shake things up. But is there any substance behind it beyond the show and tell and the pony ride that we saw in terms of all the big talk and all the grand gestures and all the things that you talked about, the excitement in the Palestinian media about it? But really, if the Israelis aren't taking it seriously, then is anything really going to happen?
So in my opinion, what we need to check in the upcoming months is the actuality of Arab countries connecting its relationship to Israel with the Palestinian cause, and to see if this visit actually paid any dividends. So one of the things I saw in the Arabic media is some sort of excitement of bringing the Palestinian cause back into center stage after years of erosion, after years of feeling that the Palestinian cause is being backsided, is being not dealt with fairly. And here comes a major power, China, who has some leverage and has gained credibility in the last year as a just broker between past foes. And here it comes and it's saying, we're going to bring it back. We want to deal with the situation. And in addition to dealing with the situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians, also maybe it can deal with this domestic situation between Fatah and Hamas. Instead of Hamas dealing with China, maybe China can also broker a domestic deal so the Palestinians can be united in one front, dealing with the Israelis on the causes that are important to them.
So let me just understand this. There's also expectations that the Chinese are going to broker some kind of settlement between Fatah. Fatah, again, is the faction that supports the Palestinian Authority. Hamas is presumably backed by the Iranians, and one controls the West Bank, the other controls the Gaza Strip. Is there really a serious expectation that Chinese have the chops to do something like that? Do they have the experience? Do they have the knowledge, the credibility? Or is this just fantasy and delusion? Because it sounds a little bit delusional to me.
So on the Palestinian side, there's the perception or image that we don't have to only deal with the Americans anymore. Americans have been biased for years against us, have been biased or very, let's say, not fair to the Arab cause in general, not only to the Palestinians. So the Palestinians will prefer to deal with the Chinese. And there is a perception that in the Palestinian media or from Palestinian scholars, including Palestinian's foreign minister itself, that Riyad al-Maliki, that the Chinese can also be a good broker between them and Hamas.
But what's that based on, though? Besides the fact that they hate the Americans, I get that. But what's that based on?
That's based on the past deal between the Iranians and Saudi Arabia, and it's based on the perception and the image that the Middle East is changing. That there has to be some sort of, let's say, united Middle Eastern front. That the Middle East is not afraid of dealing with the Chinese as an alternative to the American.
Yeah, if I can jump onto that last point. The fourth point, if I recall from the strategic partnership announcement, it talked about this last point Jony mentioned, where we can call it like a pan-Arab solidarity. And that's the idea of promoting China-Arab community with a shared destiny for a new era, as the Chinese call it.
And, that phrasing, there's a kind of a pervasive cynicism about that phrasing, I think, in Western circles. Is that idea of a shared destiny actually taken seriously in the Arab world, do you think, Tuvia? And Jony, actually, both of you.
Is it taken seriously? I don't know. I mean, I live in Israel, and it's hard for me to gauge what the Arab world is thinking. Perhaps Jony could weigh in on this. But I can give you my impression from Israel, where it's full of cynicism anyway, but when it comes to China, then doubly so.
And Jony, what do you think?
So I think that in a certain point it is taken seriously, because there's a certain view right now that if peace can be achieved between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and after the Iranian-Saudi Arabia deal, when Bilkin visited Saudi Arabia, the Saudi foreign minister and MBS both stated directly or indirectly that they speak in the voice of the Arab world. So there is some sort of perception of believing that there is a new, let's say, solidarity that's going on.
Tuvia, in Israel, does anybody take China seriously as a mediator or a broker in this issue, simply because China's relationship with the Palestinians dates back decades? In fact, there are all these pictures that Chinese propaganda and state media were putting out about, I think it was Zhou Enlai and Yasser Arafat together, and China has been unequivocal in its support for the Palestinians over the years. And in fact, just in the past 12 months, Geng Shuang, who is the Chinese UN ambassador, he has been much more critical of Israel at the UN. And historically, the Chinese have been quite critical of the Israelis and the treatment of Palestinians and on the Palestinian-Israeli issue. So again, if the Palestinian side is so enthusiastic, we have to then focus on if the Israeli side is cold to it and again doesn't see China as a credible broker, is there any hope in this ever actually materializing that China could mediate any kind of resolution? Let's not even call it a big breakthrough, but even small breakthroughs, tiny little progress and steps that are going forward. Or is that basically dead on arrival for the Israelis?
Yeah, I wouldn't hold my breath. But also for the Palestinians, it's important to qualify that they are also very skeptical about China's ability. So one anonymous Palestinian official talking to Israeli media, Israel Hayom and Haaretz, one was on the left, one on the right, they said that they're not very optimistic. But coming back to Israel, so for us, it's a non-starter to have China for many reasons, some which I mentioned. So the first one is we have the U.S. The U.S. has been involved. The U.S. is our most important partner and ally, and it has been, contrary to China, investing a lot in reaching a peace agreement with the Palestinians, albeit after Trump, they took a turn that is more biased toward Israel, according to the Palestinians. But all the more so, when we look at China, and if you mention Geng Shuang and the UN, this is just China's way to score points in the global stage. And this is not me, the biased Israeli, speaking. This is a Zhang Chuchu from Fudan University, word for word, saying exactly that. I can give you another Chinese scholar, so don't take my word. Yang Cheng in 2017, I think he's from CISU, Shanghai University, not CISU, sorry. So he said that supporting the Palestinian is the greatest political correctness in the world. And I can give you a couple dozen more quotes about this, but the point being is this is very just symbolic. China knows and Israel knows, and China knows that Israel knows that all this support is meaningless, including its voting against Israel and denunciating Israel in double standards, if you want to compare China's response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And Chinese know that the US will veto anything they pull in the UN Security Council. So all their words are basically meaningless. So there's no harm done. And again, this is not me speaking. I had my Chinese contact. He's a state, he works for the Chinese government, okay? I don't want to reveal anyone. And he told me when Abbas visited, this is going to be a big political changhe, a big show, a big occasion. And they're going to say some things that will probably anger Israel, but don't worry, it's meaningless, right? And a smiley face. So yeah, and that's not new, of course. In addition to problems in the international forums, and I can assure you, Israeli policymakers are not happy about it, with China being extremely friendly with us and talking about 1,000 years of friendship between the Jews and the Chinese people, and then the friendly faces change into ugly grimaces when they start pointing fingers at us and interfering in Israel internal affairs. Another problem is that China, except for offering its forgettable alternatives for peace, it's just hampering the process that is happening, real process in the region, and namely following the Abraham Accords. And because the US was the one who initiated it, and as Yan Xuetong says, it's not that China opposes to multilateralism like this, it's just because it hates not being next to the table. That's why it has to, oppose anything that the US suggests, because it doesn't involve itself. And I can go on that. And the last thing, and this is a very minor point, it's splitting hairs, but it is important to mention, is Chinese anti-Semitism, which I looked into. And during the conflict, the previous one, the big one in 21, and before that and after, you'd have Chinese state media and some officials, not many, but also some scholars that work with policymakers on the Middle East come out with some very anti-Semitic remarks showing their complete ignorance of Israel, of the region, of history. I mean, this week I read Peking University professor, who's well known, I'm not going to say his name, and he shared a couple of things that were factually incorrect, not me with my Israeli bias, but factually incorrect. Like, I'll give you another one. He, for example, like mentioning that Israel has complete control of the Gaza border, the Gaza Strip. And anyone with basic knowledge knows that Egypt controls about 20 kilometers of the border in the south. And I can give you 100 other examples of that. But the same Chinese scholars and policymakers that celebrate China's success with Iran and Saudi Arabia, one day before that happened, these are the same people that said that China doesn't understand the Middle East, China doesn't speak the language, doesn't have enough people. And all of a sudden, they were able to broker this deal. Congratulations, all the power to you, but come back from the stratosphere to planet Earth.
Jony, what's your response to that?
I kind of agree with Tuvia, but I also have different point of view or perspective. So what the Middle East countries, or what I've seen in the Arabic media, is basically they agree that any deal won't be possible without the United States. But they also believe that any deal that includes United States and China trying to work together, or one offering an alternative to a healthy alternative to another, might be more beneficial to all sides. So I think even if they argue that this was just a political show, I think now that the Chinese have showed the willingness to get involved will cause the Americans in one way or another to reinitiate the process. Maybe not now because it's very close to the US election next year, but maybe some sort of process will be kickstarted by the new involvements happening in the area during this time.
So if I can retort, I think it's important to remember that China has been involved in trying to mediate between Israel and the Palestinians as early, I'd say, from '89, when Foreign Minister then Chiang Chi-chen, he made the 5-point proposal for the Middle East. And since then, they've been offering all these proposals, 5-point proposal, 4-point proposal. Under Xi Jinping, he made his first one in his first year in office when he met with Abbas and Netanyahu in 2013. And that was a 4-point proposal, and another one in 2017, and now a 3-point proposal. So we lost one, but these are all boilerplate points. They also had, since 2002, their first special envoy for conflict mediation. So now they have about, 5, 6 special envoys all over the world. And one is for the Korean Peninsula, but most of them are centered here. As for Syria, Palestinians, Horn of Africa, I think Sudan too. But they have been here. They've been meeting, including recently the current envoy, Jai. So he visited Israel and the Palestinian Authority 3 times in the last 2 years. And Geng Shuang and Zhang Jun, also at the UN, the ambassadors, every single month, and you can check it on their website, every single month they bring up the Palestinian issue. And in the UN, criticizing Israel, offering solutions. And they also had made 4 peace symposiums in Beijing. The last one was online in 21. But the people that they invite are only peace sympathizers, not policymakers. They have absolutely zero bearing on policy here in Israel or the Palestinian Authority. And I'm not even talking about Chinese aid or trade or any substantial numbers of support to the Palestinians that could actually help a single Palestinian person, let alone the peace process. And that's why I don't think that the US also takes China's new 3 proposals too seriously. I mean, I'm sure they're following it. I'm sure they're talking about it with the Israelis and the Palestinians. But we have to put this in perspective.
Jony, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Abbas's own credibility. In how trusted is he by the Palestinian public at the moment to represent them in these international forums? And what should we make of what I've seen kind of described in the international press as kind of repressive backsliding by the Palestinian Authority, within the Palestinian territories?
My own opinion, so what I personally think, Abbas's credibility is declining. He's getting quite old, and there are a lot of domestic problems in the Palestinian Authority regarding who's going to succeed him. So there's kind of been, in the past couple of months, a quibble, a succession race going of who's going to succeed Mahmoud Abbas. The Palestinian public take it cautiously, that the president is going to be replaced in a certain stage, but for now they're happy that the cause is getting a global stage, that they're happy that they maybe alternative development plans will be initiated, because as you know, a lot of Palestinian development on the macro level is dependent on external economic assistance from other countries. So they are happy to be a part of the BRI process. They're happy to be a part of any process that might bring economic prosperity to their people.
Jony, this question that I brought up at the beginning of the show about Xinjiang, I think is also very interesting. Why is it, do you think, that Abbas was so accommodating to the Chinese on the treatment of Muslims in China, and at the same time, obviously being the victim in many respects of maltreatment at the hands of the Israelis? And that has been a cause that worldwide the Muslim population has denounced, but yet in China, Abbas gave it the thumbs up. Do you have any insights into what the politics were, the thinking was on the question of Xinjiang?
So regarding the question of Xinjiang, in the end, it's a cost-benefit analysis. So in the end, Arab leaders sometimes need to choose practical implications and measures and what they get out of it over choosing to back or oppose a human rights issue. So I think in this aspect, he can't say much because he needs more from the Chinese than what the Chinese need from him. So, in my opinion, maybe he's not in the position to bring it up like other Arab countries.
Which, to be fair, they don't bring it up either.
He doesn't have the leverage to bring it up like, let's say, Saudi Arabia or UAE or any other major Arab or Muslim power.
Well, also, let's not forget that Somalia has, on the past 2 UN Human Rights Council votes on Xinjiang, has voted against China. So Somalia and Turkey right now are the only 2 Muslim majority countries that have taken public stands against China.
And Israel, too.
Well, obviously Israel, but not a Muslim majority country.
Yeah, you wrote today in your newsletter that Turkey's new UN Human Rights Council, right? Something like that.
Yeah, well, let's just quickly kind of, start wrapping up our discussion. And I want to get both of your takes on this. There's this question of if the Israelis don't take the Chinese seriously as mediators and the Palestinians don't take the Americans serious as mediators, Tuvia, where are we now? Are we where we started from? Really, at the end of the day, we've had a bunch of pomp and circumstance and ceremony and beautiful honor guards being displayed. But at the end of the day, the ball hasn't moved farther, or is there actually any movement that you can detect, given the fact that the Chinese now, as Jony has pointed out, have elevated the issue onto the international stage again?
I agree with Jony. I think it's a wait and see now if any of the words will be backed up with any deeds. Take, for example, the 4 deals that they struck during Abbas's visit on infrastructure and on solar panel manufacturing and also steel plant, if I recall. So the solar panel manufacturing deal, that had already existed long before, and it's been in negotiation. The problem is that Chinese entrepreneurs, they don't want to invest too much in the Palestinian Authority due to security reasons, political reasons. And it's not very lucrative, and corruption, which is a major problem there. And that's why Chinese investment in the Palestinian Authority, including Gaza, are negligible, whereas in Israel, it's cumulative more than $20 billion, even more than that. So shortly, we need to wait and see. A lot of it is we need to sieve through the delusion and hubris and propaganda for domestic audience and internationally. Of course, that's there too. Also riding the wave of the Saudi-Iran mediation success, albeit overstated, as Cobus mentioned. But still, the Palestinians don't have many options. And they see the Biden administration, if not biased, then just disinterested. And it was, I think, one of the cases made when Biden just came into office that they will focus less on the Palestinian cause because they don't see any realistic conditions for any negotiations in any case. So China is a good alternative to start, but also there's high expectations from China. Some are very misplaced, but still they exist in the global south, mainly people who are not here on the ground and know the realities. And China wants to live up to some of these expectations as a major power. And this is also very traditional when it comes to Chinese support of the Palestinians. In the beginning, when they first started supporting them more actively in the 60s. So it was doing so in a way to both get the support of the developing world and because it wanted to support militants where the Soviet Union was active and giving it trouble. It also forces that are anti-American and also the support of the Muslim world and Arab world. So you get 4 or 5 birds with one stone. And here too, it's almost the same. And because it's the second largest economy, because it's has a permanent seat at the UN Security Council, all these combined, they give some impetus to China to do something. That's also Xi's slogan, do something, achieve something, be active. That's, I think, what he also expects from his diplomats.
Question, like maybe impossible to answer question for both of you. We spent the hour essentially kind of debunking any idea that China has credibility in brokering this peace process. And as you mentioned, both China and the United States face very strong doubts, kind of from different local populations. Who else is there? Like, what are your prospects, or how do you see the prospects for the Israeli-Palestinian kind of peace process over the next few years? And which external actors do you think would have any kind of credibility to broker anything there?
For me, what I believe, like any peace process that might happen will happen with a combination of countries. So let's say, for example, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Palestine, of course, China, and the United States and Russia. So I think without these states sitting together and trying to find a possible way forward, we will stay stuck. Like, both sides agree that without the other major power, they can't do anything.
Tuvia, you get the last word.
All right. So my take is that any process needs, first and foremost, agreement on both sides and condition, Israel and the Palestinians. Right now, there are no conditions on either side. In Israel, we talked about the judicial reform, and also many mentioned that Israel has a right-wing government. I don't think that's necessarily a problem, because there had been right-wing government that made peace before. In the Palestinian side, it's corrupt, it's fragmented. So I think the only way forward is for a political change in the Palestinian Authority and political change here in Israel that could make the basic conditions for relaunching the negotiations. And then when we start talking about external involvement, the US, of course, will have to be involved, as well as Jordan and Egypt. And I think Saudi Arabia would also like to be involved. I don't know if it's Israel's interest to have it involved here. The quartet mechanism, which included the EU and Russia, hasn't been very active, to be honest. And with China, again, China, if it really is interested in mediating peace or facilitating it, as they describe, they need to remember that they have to have the US at the table as well. Otherwise, they're doing a disservice to the whole process.
Well, that seems rather unlikely in the current environment when the US and China have a difficulty sitting at any table, much less one with the Israelis and the Palestinians. So, interesting points of view. Tuvia Gering is a researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies in Jerusalem and also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Tuvia, you are prolific in publishing. Tell everybody where they can find you, both on Twitter and how they can sign up for Discourse Power.
Well, thank you. So my handle on Twitter is Gering Tuvia, one word, and on Substack it's just Discourse Power.
Okay, we will put links to all of that in the show notes. And again, I cannot recommend enough that you sign up for Discourse Power. What Tuvia does basically is he takes a lot of what Chinese scholars are saying and translates it and gives it to you in their language. So it's absolutely fascinating. And he talks a lot about global affairs and a lot of topics that will be of great interest to this audience. So I highly recommend it. And also, if you are an Arabic speaker, you're going to want to check out our Arabic language website. Again, you can just go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and right at the top, you'll find Arabic, French, and English, and the link for that. Jony Essa is the editor of it. And Jony, if people want to follow what we're doing in Arabic on Twitter, where can they find us?
So they can find us at Sin Sharq al-Awsat. So it's SINSHARQAWSAT.
Okay, we have a link to that in the show notes as well. Tuvia, Jony, thank you both for your fascinating insights. I wish there was a cleaner breakthrough that we could understand and get our heads around, but this is, of course, the Palestinian-Israeli issue, and we were not going to solve it today, and something tells me the Chinese are going to struggle with it as well. But I want to thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
There is such a huge discrepancy between the analysis from Tuvia and to some extent from Jony, and certainly our take on this, and the borderline hubris that we saw coming out of Chinese scholars and the Chinese press for their prowess now in being able to mediate Middle East peace. And again, this is one of those cases where I think the Chinese are getting way ahead of themselves, particularly Chinese scholars, in saying that they are the new force in the Middle East, they are the new power. They're stepping into very, very treacherous territory that is extraordinarily difficult. And I'm not sure that they have, actually, let me rephrase that. I know that they don't have the competence, the historical experience, the language skills, the relationships to get into this space. And at the same time, I think that there is so much enthusiasm for what happened between the Saudis and the Iranians. And there's a lack of nuance in the Chinese discourse over this because they're framing it as that China did everything. And I think, as Tuvia pointed out, and Jony as well, the Chinese were a very critical role in that relationship, very critical role in helping to reestablish diplomatic ties. But the evidence is clear that they played a role in the last 5% of the process. The Omanis, the Iraqis, the Saudis, the Iranians, all those other players were instrumental in the first 95% of the process. Now, it couldn't have been done without the Chinese maybe at the end. That's for sure. I think a lot of people agree on that. But to suggest that the Chinese were responsible for this is, again, to me, they're getting over their skis. And I think when they say they can mediate between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the only word that I have is delusional, especially because the Israelis have made it very, very clear that they really are not that interested in the Chinese stepping into this process.
The way I see this is that it has a lot more to do with factors not only within China, but factors specifically facing these researchers. I think they're under a lot of pressure to be boosterish about China, and particularly to push a narrative that China is renewing things in the Middle East. And because this discourse is mostly happening in Chinese, and because they know that they're not being read in the Middle East, it doesn't really matter, right? Kind of how realistic this is, how realistic this viewpoint is, doesn't really matter. What matters to them at the moment is making sure that they are covered within their own academic context within China, I think. So in that sense, I think it's a kind of a similar situation as many other people. It's a similar situation as the South Africans years ago when they announced that they're going to be mediating in Israel, or now with they announced that they're going to be mediating in Ukraine. It essentially plays to a domestic audience. It doesn't particularly have any real objective kind of criteria that it be judged by internationally.
And I think that is also an important takeaway for how to frame this whole visit from the past week, that the optics in many ways were far more important than the substance of it. Xi got to put himself on the stage as, again, a Middle East leader and power broker and mediator. And at the same time, Abbas got to elevate the Palestinian issue back onto the world stage as well, to put pressure on the Israelis to do something, and to some extent the Americans. And the Americans, of course, are part of all of this because it fueled the narrative that the Americans are no longer relevant in the Middle East, that China is the new power in the Middle East. We heard that over and over again. And it played into the U.S. domestic election campaign that's underway, where different camps were saying, see, this is more evidence that the United States is no longer relevant. That is, of course, in dispute in the United States. The Biden administration says absolutely not. They sent Blinken to Riyadh again to say we are very much engaged in the region. So again, these are all the moving parts of it. But I think if you look at this from the point of view of optics rather than substance, you're going to get a lot more takeaways on it. Let's get some final thoughts from you in terms of the Middle East, that the Chinese are looking at Arab-Israeli peace. That's, again, their next project for mediation. I don't think it's going to go very far. We have also the Iran-Saudi arrangement. And then there's this issue of the Saudis and the Israelis coming together. Well, the United States is trying to broker that. There have been whispers that that is something also on the Chinese agenda as well, to see if they could negotiate something there. Again, that's a very big undertaking. I'm not entirely sure they have the chops for doing this. Cobus, this is one of those things where it looks great for the Chinese when everything goes well, but the Middle East is riddled with disappointment and failed ambitions and hopes and dreams when it comes to peace. And it'll be interesting to see how the Chinese deal with adversity, which will invariably come sooner probably than later.
Yeah, the one thing that the Middle East definitely is riddled with is double talk, and everyone rushing to pretend that they care about the plight of the Palestinians, even the Palestinian Authority rushing to pretend that they care about the plight of the Palestinians. I would suggest that instead that people kind of like take all of this talk with a grain of salt and rather track where capital is moving. And where capital is moving is from China into the Middle East, not into the
Specifically the Persian Gulf. Specifically to the Persian Gulf.
not into the Palestinian areas particularly, but into other, as you say, into the Persian Gulf and other parts of the Middle East. There's an incredible amount of different kinds of commercial deals being struck between Saudi Arabia and China, like on a daily basis. We can be picking stuff up literally on a daily basis. So that's, I think, where the real action lies. And with that, then a whole bunch of issues in relation to the use of the dollar in oil trade, the kind of rise of green energy as this very interesting developing field of investment for China in the Middle East. And I think the flows of capital are going to shift the politics over time, but it's going to take years and years, I think.
Let's just close our discussion again on this question of the Uyghurs. And it was very interesting because there was a palpable sense of disappointment that Abbas wholeheartedly endorsed the Chinese line on Xinjiang. I mean, there was nothing subtle about it. And it's yet another Arab leader lining up with the Chinese on Xinjiang, which again is a major disappointment to Uyghur activists around the world who have been trying to rally support for their cause. If anybody would have credibility in this, it would be, of course, the Palestinians, who have themselves become a case study for, Muslim suffering. And so it's just, again, very, very interesting how leaders, not just in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, but also in Asia as well, just do not see Xinjiang as an issue to cross the Chinese on. It's just not worth it in their view. And as Tuvia and Jony both said, it's a cost-benefit analysis. And at the end of the day, they look at Xinjiang as a cost.
I think it's also an issue that's become so structured by US-Chinese geopolitics that it's very difficult for outside players to really, take on to find a way of occupying some kind of some version of their own position on the issue. I think it's you fall on either side of the geopolitical line so quickly. It was notable that the government of East Turkestan in Exile, which is this Uyghur pressure group based in Washington DC, was one of the most notable protest voices against Abbas's kind of stance on the Uyghurs in China. And it is interesting. It's very difficult to find a space in that discussion that doesn't break down along US-China lines. And I think a lot of kind of outside actors see it that way and they just avoid the issue completely.
I think that's a good point. There just is no room for them to create a policy that won't get sucked into the polarized narratives on this issue, so they just assume put it aside for now. Very interesting. What a fascinating hour we've had. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. And also, we want to invite you to try out our brand new AI ChatGPT-powered chatbot that we've launched on the site. I wrote a big editorial this week kind of expressing that, hey, everybody, it's not perfect. ChatGPT isn't perfect, but it's a first step that we're taking into this new AI universe. So subscribers to the China Africa Project and the China Global South Project can get access to our new AI-powered chatbot. What we were trying to do is to be able to provide a more balanced, holistic, Global South perspective on a lot of these China issues. Try it out. Specifically, if you are interested in China-Africa issues, it's much stronger than China-Middle East and other issues simply because our content database isn't as rich in other regions of the world as it is in Africa, but we'd love for you to try it out. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/chat, and you'll be able to play with the tool a little bit. That, of course, comes with your subscription to the China Global South Project. We'd love for you to support the independent journalism that Cobus, myself, and the rest of the team are doing in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Subscriptions are very affordable. You get 30 days for free. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. So for Cobus Van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander today, joining you from New York. I'll be back in Southeast Asia later this summer. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.